They have conflicting results here. So a great model here with Potvin and McGill, they suggested that if you stoop to lift, bend your spine a lot, you'll have more anterior shear. Compression's the same versus a squat, right? So no difference in compression, but you'll see that the shear loads on the spine, they're more. And so some have said, well, maybe that's a problem. That's the assumption that this load is somehow bad for the spine. Other researchers measuring that same type of load, I'll show you here, shear, have found that stooping, right, bending your spine a lot, has less shear. The difference between the two papers is one estimated shear at L4, L5, one of the segments in the lumbar spine. The other estimated the shear at the next segment down. So, like, what do we do with this data? You just have to choose, which segment you don't want to load. So again, the point is we have conflicting biomechanical models. Maybe we should ignore them. Or you can pay attention to this one because it's very much in line with my bias. This is the most recent one. They measured all of those other things. Plus, they tried to estimate the stresses specifically on the disc at 40 and 65 degrees of flexion. And again, they found the same thing that everyone else finds. If you try to keep your spine in neutral, hence lordotic, you're going to flex at 20 degrees here. If you try here, I'll show you this one where you're flexed a lot. You can flex at 30 degrees here. That's what you see when you try to keep it in neutral. When you stoop, you get 40 degrees, right? So you can change the posture a little bit, but you can't really avoid getting, 60 to 70 to 80% of max flexion. So let's assume this kyphotic posture is almost maximal. That person is at, 75% of maximal. And what they found was, when you flex your spine a lot, you're going to put more stress on the passive tissues, right? The ligaments, the disc, the fascia, and less on the muscles. That's why it's more efficient. And when you're in a lordotic posture, your muscles are working more, right? And that's why it's more metabolically demanding. But this is what's so interesting about this study. But they estimated disc strain, and that's why most people are worried about spinal flexion, because there is the assumption that disc strain, right, is worse with spinal flexion. And they found that being kyphotic or lordotic didn't really influence it. Right? If you're kyphotic and you shifted to lordotic, it barely changed the strain on the disc. So why are we worrying about keeping the spine in neutral? And what's interesting is that the actual tissue strain was 10%. And if you remember from that animal model, the cell cultures, 10% is a catalyst for adaptation, meaning your disc might be able to adapt. And it doesn't seem like you'll pay for it later. People say, if you flex a lot, you're fine now, but one day, boom, your back's gonna go. We don't have a lot of research here. I only know of one paper, and they looked at skiers, cross-country skiers, lots of flexion, rowers, lots of flexion, orienteers, I don't know what the hell they do, they just know where they are in space or something, and a control group. And what they found was no difference in 10-year low back pain. It didn't matter if you had a history of spinal flexion. It's just, you're not gonna pay for it later. According to this small study, guess what? We do need more research. It's okay to be on the fence here. When might it be reasonable to avoid spine flexion or try to minimize it or try to obtain neutral? Maybe go from 95% of max flexion down to 80. That is certainly possible, but you can't go from 90 to say 15. You can't do stuff like that. So for training and performance, absolutely. If you think a less flexed spine is better for your sport, then do it, okay? And then 3 and 4 are kind of the same. If it hurts, yes, it is totally reasonable to back off for a bit. Just avoid the pattern that's sensitive temporarily. And then the last one here is the second one here, would be maybe it's good inherently to have a number of different movement options. So if you always flex when you do something, it might be valuable just to have different options on how to do it. That's more of just an opinion. So there you go. There's 7 reasons maybe to avoid neutral instead of avoiding spinal flexion, but 7 reasons to be an optimist if you do see someone with spinal flexion, just to say, nah, that's not really worth it. It's not a big driver of low back pain. It's not something we want to focus on. All right, adios.